Hello, my name is Paul Blum, and I'm here to present a presentation on receptive and expressive issues that goes on within learning. My presentation outline starts off with the introduction to receptive and expressive issues. Within that, there are three types of issues or impairments. The first is mental impairment. Within mental impairment, we can look at autism, Fragile X syndrome, as well as language delay, which specifically looks at R-ELD and ELD. Another sort of impairment that we will be talking about today is behavioral impairments, which include ODD, ADHD, as well as institutionalized children. The final impairment that we will be discussing today is bilingual impairment. Bilingual impairment includes the gap in students with and without learning impairment. I will end the presentation with a conclusion as well as several pages of references. Now to begin, according to the American Psychiatric Association, receptive and expressive issues, also known as mixed receptive and expressive language disorder, are when both the receptive and expressive areas of communications are effective cases mild to severe. Symptoms of this issue includes difficulty understanding words, sentences, or specific types of words, as well as unable to express oneself. A person showing these issues will also have difficulty communicating and academically, professionally, and socially in life. However, there is a similar symptoms to a different disorder called pervasive developmental disorder, where a person shows these symptoms because they try to be pervasive against having to take part in societal matters. Be sure when dealing with these symptoms that this is not the disorder that you have. Also present with this is mental disorders, speech sensory deficit, as well as environmental deprivations. Now, to start with the impairments, the first one we will talk about is autism. Now, when looking at a range of average to 4 to 11-year-old children, receptive are words that are spoken comprehension, which usually will take 8 to 10 months to fully comprehend within the mind. But it will take around 12 to 16 months until the children will use those words. Now, with autism, also known as autism spectrum disorder, tested that 20 to 28% of children with that disorder had similar profiles to your average student, meaning 3/4 of children with autism scored lower. Now, there are two reasons believed for this lack of attention. The first one would be is lack of attention towards a speaker. With lack of attention towards a speaker, there are two factors to be pointed out. The first one is tune in. When a teacher talks to a student with autism, they are more than likely to seem disinterested or look away instead of not focusing. What they need to be doing instead is to tune in. Tune up, the child is able to reply with what's been saying to them. Speech detection thresholds, speech perception accuracy, and speech processing speeds are all factors that help detach from what autism separates from average students. Their detection to certain ways that we speak is slower, the perception of the accuracy of the words that were said is slower, and the processing speed to which they comprehend the words also is slower. Now, the other factor to show us that autism has an impairment with this is that oral motor performance. Now, dyspraxia and childhood apraxia of speech could be a factor. Dyspraxia is a form of motor function that is failing to reach its full potential. Childhood apraxia of speech is when a child tries to say or speak certain things, but they are unable to shape their mouths, their tones, in order to reach the words they are seeking. Now, apraxia of speech has been found in 66% of all autism cases. The next form of mental impairment is the Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome inherited intellectual disability. It is strictly passed down through genes. It is a rare trait. Now, different symptoms that can be found of Fragile X syndrome can be found on image 1 to the right, which include broad forehead, elongated face, large predominant ears, cross-eyed, high arched palate, among many others. Now, most people who have Fragile X syndrome are male. When it comes to the diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome, around 50 to 75% of these children will also be diagnosed with some form of autism. 90% of nonverbal cognitive abilities are within the intellectual disability range, meaning that the higher nonverbal IQ and receptive vocabulary are much higher than the average child with autism, but they also have an equally low expressive ability as autism children. Meaning that while Fragile X syndrome is able to have more input into their own nonverbal IQ and be able to take in more vocabulary, they cannot express it back. The third form of mental impairment is language delay. Within that, there is the receptive expressive language delay, which is R-ELD, and the expressive only language delay, which is ELD. Now, the way that these were found were shown to small children before the ability to fully forward communicate by doing different hand gestures to try to communicate with a child. R-ELD do not understand, nor are they able to communicate the gestures from any other form of signal. While children with ELD can understand gestures and receptive language, but have trouble conveying the language back to the presenter. ODD is oppositional defiant disorder. Now, ODD is known for children who have anger issues, are clearly defiant in the classroom, and can often be angry or have some misplaced disobedience towards authority figures. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. ADHD is for children who are unable to sit still, who lack the attention to sit in a classroom, or to focus on one task at a time. 10% of school children are diagnosed with some form of ODD or ADHD. And it's said that 50% of preschool children that have been diagnosed have both ODD and ADHD. When testing mentally impaired children, roughly 39% of these children will also have rather some form of ODD and ADHD or both combined. Students with ODD and ADHD will score lower on expressive language than your average student. Both lower receptive and expressive vocabulary were associated with students that had both ADHD and ODD symptoms. Students with both ADHD and ODD are at a larger risk of having severe language problems later in life. But however, ODD and ADHD can be fixed with intervention of developing language expressions, promoting peer interactions among their fellow classmates, as well as identifying positive social cues that they do throughout the day. If this does not help, then this child may need further medical study to see if it is a biological issue within the brain. Now, the second behavioral impairment is institutionalized children. In a case study in Brazil, over 20,000 children are seen institutionalized in some form of shelter for various reasons. The study found that children did not show much difference in sheltered and family households when it came to reactionary and expressive testing. However, higher risk were the children within the shelters for attention span disorders, which then can in turn lead to language impairments. In fact, it was roughly 10 to 25% of a higher risk to live in a shelter to form some form of language delay or disorder. Now, the final type of impairment is bilingual impairment. Now, being a child who grows up bilingual, there are some positives to it. You have an inhibition to seek more knowledge. You also are better at switching your attention to different tasks, and you will have a master memory control. However, the negatives are that there's a smaller receptive vocabularies that you can intake at one time. You are also slower to react to name things, and you are also slower to identify certain pictures. Now, there's two different hypotheses when it comes to the reason why bilingual children have a slight impairment compared to monolingual. The first is the weaker links hypothesis. Now, the weaker links hypothesis is all based around the word frequency effect. Because these children know two separate words for one object, once one gets used more often, the other gets used less. Therefore, in order for a word to become more concrete within their mind, it needs to be used more frequently. Therefore, this impairment is only temporary. The other is the inhibition hypothesis, meaning that the more successful the child is in the receptive, the less successful they will be in the expressive. Within the inhibition hypothesis, a child will think more about what the answer is because of the multitude of language that they have. Now, another study saw that the receptive expressive ability was tested against a test called the test of narrative language, where a story is told to children, and then they would have to test and answer the questions based off of the narrative. Bilingual children with some form of language impairment were seen to score lower than their monolingual classmates, which the same can be said with those without any disabilities. Of bilingual children scored lower than their monolingual classmates as well. To conclude, there are three types of impairments. The first is mental impairment. Within mental impairment, we have autism. Now, autism we can see as a mental impairment because of the lack of attention towards the speaker and the difficulty with their oral motor performance. Also, we have Fragile X syndrome, with their expressive is as bad as autism, but they can retain more for the reaction. Also is reaction expressive language disorders. The behavioral impairments include ODD, which stood for Oppositional Defiant Disorder, and ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which the more problems with the expressive than the receptive. And this is also the only impairment that can be treated early as well. Family structures help children be less likely to have any impairments than children within shelters. Also, bilingual children may face more risks because of processing and identifying more words than monoliths.